Oh, and here we are again. It's always such a pleasure, TJ. Do you remember when you tried to kill me twice?
What do you mean tried? I'm wondering why I'm being haunted right now.
Hey.
You know what I
Did you
could
put
go
something
for
in the
right
water?
now? I could go for some potatoes.
Welcome to Non Sequitur Theater.
Yes.
Satoru Iwata is dead.
All right. So
Wow, there's a... Now, that is about... That's...
yeah.
That's how to break
There's
the
tact,
subject.
and then there's TJ.
Hey, you know what? You know what? I gotta
You
give
were
him credit.
beating around the bush. I had to
Yeah.
go out and say it. We have a segment to do, don't we?
Yes.
That's true.
Yes.
But you know what? He's as blunt and as tactless as I am, so that's why he fits in so well here.
Well, now I have to make up for two of you now, so that's just great.
Oh,
anyway, so yes, the president of Nintendo and its CEO worldwide, Satoru Iwata, died at age 55 of a bile duct tumor. He'd had surgery to attempt to ameliorate this about a year earlier, but apparently it did not succeed, and he passed away. So,
And from what I'm to understand, it's kind of a particularly difficult to treat form of liver cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
That was what I was curious of. I knew it was a cancer of some sort, but I wasn't like bile duct. It's like, okay, that's got to be a cancer, but which part of the body?
Mm-hmm. Liver's probably a liver or some kind of stomach area, but one way or the other.
Well, as TJ said, it was liver, so we'll go with his.
Okay. Yeah, neither one of us are biologists, so we'll be fine. But in any event, this has caused a pretty significant outpouring of support throughout the video game community. It's brought a lot of people together that you would not think would hold this gentleman in such high regard. For example, the official English language PlayStation Twitter handle tweeted out, "Thank you, Mr. Iwata, you will be missed," on Sunday when the news broke. So that should tell you something about how well respected this gentleman was.
And the impact that he had on, gaming as a whole.
I know the music producer, songwriter, singer, Tsunku respected him very heavily too. So
He was kind of a renaissance man. He had experience on pretty much every facet of Nintendo from, back in the 80s when he was pounding out the code for Balloon Fight, which apparently became the basis for the underwater mechanics in Super Mario Brothers. So he had a connection there.
Yeah.
Then he worked at HAL Labs on some of the Kirby games, Earthbound. He had input with Game Freak during the development of Pokemon Gold and that general area. And then he found himself in charge of the company when Hiroshi Yamauchi stepped down.
Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Iwata was in charge of Nintendo during the latter chunk of the GameCube era and into the Wii and Wii U eras. So, it's not really much of an understatement to say that he did change video gaming forever. He was the originator of the Blue Ocean strategy that brought Nintendo to such prominence during the Wii era. And for good or for ill, the effects of that we're still seeing now in the video game industry.
the Blue Ocean?
Yes. The Blue Ocean strategy was the general phrasing that kind of popped up around the idea of making video games available and accessible to people outside of what was then considered the core audience. This meant motion controls. This meant simplified controls for complicated games. That's why you had things like Wii Tennis being such a very simple thing with more or less one-to-one controls with the Wiimote, and it was...
Everyone picked it up.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone could immediately go, oh, this is supposed to be a tennis racket. I can do this. Mm-hmm. Oh, this is supposed to be a bowling ball. I can do this.
But this also filtered into the hardware design of the Wii as well. because with the GameCube, Nintendo had been pushing innovation, pushing graphical fidelity and a lot of different functionalities to become on parity with the PS2, the Dreamcast, I guess, to a certain extent, and the then upcoming Xbox. Graphics were the big driving force between the two chips in the GameCube. No, it was just the one chip. That's right. Hollywood and Broadway were Wii. That's right. But when it came time for the Wii, Iwata said that graphics cannot be the sole innovation of this console. I read a quote from him earlier today saying, there is no end to the desire of people who want more. If you give them one, they'll ask for two. If you give them two, they'll ask for 5 next time and not 3. It just becomes what I think it was Jeremy Bentham who said was the hedonistic treadmill. It basically just becomes this never-ending cycle. You're always going to be in a chase with the latest and the greatest. And that was not going to work with Nintendo's business model, and it was not going to work to get them back into prominence, because as popular and as strong as the GameCube was, it was still second place.
Second?
Well, the Dreamcast died. So,
Say what you will, the GameCube was a really good system.
yes.
I'm not going to knock the system.
It was in a very awkward place because it had to rebuild all of the third-party support that the N64 lost.
Yeah, because
And to that end, it managed to get, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. Right there. It was Nintendo rebuilding the bridge with Square.
And I do say second because worldwide it was second. Between America and Japan, it did outsell the Xbox.
yeah.
So, while it
Granted,
was... yeah,
anything could have outsold the Xbox in Japan.
right.
Yeah, the Xbox was a colossal flop.
But the thing was, in North America, where the GameCube was such a perceived failure, that hurt a lot of things. And remember that Mr. Iwata had a strong background in Nintendo of America as well. He was in charge of it for a certain amount of time, wasn't he? I think so. Either that
I don't
or...
recall off the top of my head.
well, I know he did spend some time as a head in Nintendo of America, probably working with Mr. Minoru Arakawa at some point. But when he did take the position, Mr. Iwata, of CEO of Nintendo, he made it his goal to ensure that Nintendo would not be stuck in the constant rat race of graphical fidelity, graphical upgrades. He said, there have got to be different ways that people can play, which led to the DS having the multiple screens and the touch screen on the portable, which led to the Wii being motion controlled, which led to the Wii U and the gamepad. So these are things that I dare say a lesser individual would never have considered, and especially not for a company with the pedigree of Nintendo at that point.
Suffice to say, as opposed to Hiroshi Yamauchi, who he replaced, Iwata took risks. Iwata came out in favor of, as he said, radical design deviations from the norm, just rolling in things that hadn't even been considered before. And I mean, just look at the sales numbers for the Wii and the DS. They took off.
Yeah, the DS was huge. I mean, Sony could never catch it with the PlayStation Portable or even the Vita.
Or anyone else, really.
Yeah, because I mean, there was the Wonder Swan that the
Neo Geo Pocket Color. Come on.
yeah.
One of the quotes that actually really exemplifies that concept of risk-taking comes from his keynote at the 2006 Game Development Conference. The keynote was titled Disrupting Development. He said, thinking differently and holding strongly to your strategy can disrupt an entire industry, and in a good way. That is the core of what Nintendo's philosophy post Mr. Yamauchi has been. I think I remember seeing on the GameCube box a quote from Shigeru Miyamoto saying, you look at a door and you wonder, what if there's something else on the other side of it? It creates a spark of wonder when you stop being constrained by what exists and you let your imagination run wild. And I think that's no more strongly evident than in a lot of the things that came out during Mr. Iwata's reign. I mean, you had Pikmin later on in the GameCube life. You had... he was the guy who developed Super Smash Brothers originally, wasn't he?
He was one of the forces behind it. I believe he was actually kind of the mediator between Masahiro Sakurai and Shigeru Miyamoto.
Right.
And Miyamoto wasn't exactly sold on the whole concept of a bunch of Nintendo characters fighting each other.
Right.
But Iwata didn't actually tell Sakurai that Miyamoto didn't approve or wasn't seeing the idea behind it until Sakurai had built the prototype, basically the engine for Smash Brothers, which he then showed again to Miyamoto, who went, okay, I get it now.
Right.
This is the idea.
And the playtesters finding that delight in what at that time was an extremely novel form of fighting game was also a big part of that.
I mean, it's barely a fighting game, and at the same time, it is perfectly a fighting game.
Yes.
It is that disruption of the paradigm that is pretty much emblematic of the whole of Iwata's tenure.
And then games such as Splatoon that take core concepts from established genres, throw them out in favor of other concepts for experimental sake or just for fun. This was a concept that they had an idea for it and they just kept iterating it until it was fun.
And it all made sense.
Yeah.
Why are 2 blocks of tofu spreading ink all over the place? We don't know. Why are rabbit people spreading ink all over the place? We don't know. But once they hit squids, everything made sense. More backstory that you can get on the fantastic interview series that Iwata did with a number of the developers from games throughout the past several years. The Iwata Asks series. It's available on Nintendo's website. Read them and you will get a glimpse into the depths of game design that will rock your world.
And he's a fantastic interviewer as well. If you spend a couple days, just evenings reading the whole thing, you'll see that he really knows his stuff and he really knows how to probe the developers' minds to figure out why they made these decisions. But more than that, you mentioned during the development of Splatoon, they started out as tofu blocks and then they went to rabbits. Any other developer in the world, and I'm looking directly at Capcom, would have canned the game at the tofu block phase. Because they would not have thrown more development money and time into this idea that wasn't immediately an obvious sell. It took time, and it took effort, and it took making mistakes in order to refine Splatoon into the arguable game of the year. And Nintendo took those risks. You don't see that kind of risk-taking, that kind of gambling, I guess you could call it, from any other developer in the industry. not EA, not Activision, definitely not Capcom, definitely not Konami. Nintendo, under Mr. Iwata, is constantly changing the video game industry. And I don't really think there's anything else that can be said about the passion that he brought to his development team and the culture of making those leaps of faith.
Well, it certainly was helped by the fact that that's where he came from. He was a developer, a programmer, and it's why the Iwata Asks series covers exactly the right questions, is because he's been there in the trenches, pounding through code, optimizing things, and hitting exactly the same roadblocks that these younger developers are hitting today.
Wasn't he the reason that the Hoenn region, or
The Kanto region was in
Gold and Silver?
Pokemon Gold and Silver.
Mm-hmm.
He was the guy who looked at, what Game Freak had up to that point, which was the entire cart taken up by the new Johto region, and said, we can optimize this, we can compress this, and he created so much room by optimization that they could fit the entire Kanto region from red and blue, or red and green properly, onto the new generation.
And more importantly, this was on hardware that was 10 years old at that point. This was the Game Boy, the original Game Boy platform, which had an extremely limited address space.
Yeah, because that was the very end of the Game Boy, right before the Game Boy Color, which would have been Pokemon Crystal.
Yeah, Crystal was the first game for the Game Boy Color.
Right. And again, even Crystal was still hampered a little bit by the
Backwards compatibility. And
it wouldn't be until Ruby and Sapphire with the Game Boy Advance that the technology underlying the cartridges could support a game of drastically larger size than anything else in the Game Boy Advance library, even to this day.
yet Iwata was making it happen way back on the old hardware.
One of the stories he tells is while he was in college, he had picked up one of the first Hewlett-Packard programmable calculators with a display of digits. Not dot matrix, not anything like that, but digits. It was a calculator, and he made a baseball game. I have absolutely no idea how that would work.
That one.
That's
Yeah. Yeah. That actually, he recounts that story in his 2005 Game Developer Conference keynote, which is colloquially called the Heart of a Gamer speech. And look that up if it hasn't been linked to you already out there in Podcastia, because it...
Jim, get off your butt and link to it, okay?
Yes.
fine. Send me a link. I'll put it in the show notes.
I certainly will.
Good job.
Certainly will.
Yay!
Earn your bagel.
But he did have this spark about him where he was a man of all roles in both HAL Laboratory, where he was literally the fifth employee hired in the company, which of course strained relations with his dad. But he then was sort of doing a little bit of everything. He was programming. He was in charge of marketing his game. He was doing the art. He was doing the music. It was pretty much the whole 9 yards. And it all really came to a head when HAL Laboratories approached Nintendo, and Nintendo farmed off the debug and polishing process for the Famicom launch title Pinball to HAL Laboratory. And for those of you who've ever actually had a chance to take a look at that game, it's available on the Virtual Console. It's not a terribly complex pinball game.
It's just got one table about... It was two
Two or three
screens and then the
screens,
bonus screen.
Yeah. but there are quirks in there that seem too perfect to have been planned. And that is the sort of thing that exemplifies a lot of what Mr. Iwata did. He had the ability to see beyond just what was being presented to him. I mean, hey, he managed to turn digits into baseball players. So I can't compete with that.
Fun fact, Satoru Iwata actually managed to program the entirety of NES tournament golf using only ones. Nah, that's just a little Chuck Norrisism right now.
Yeah.
All right, I think we need to move on. So, thanks, guys.
Thank you.